Hi, everyone. Welcome. You have joined us here on a special edition of DevOps Unbound. My name is Mitch Ashley. I am CTO with Techstrong Group, who puts together this program along with many others, and also head of the research division, analyst research for Techstrong Research. And we have a great topic. A lot of folks have come by today to participate in this and join us in the audience. And we're talking about AI in our software and not just using AI to create software, but how about using AI within our software? This program is a ongoing series, DevOps Unbound. It's available on Techstrong TV, Techstrong.tv. We've been doing this, I think, a little over 3 years now, and built up a really good following, great audience, and wonderful panelists and speakers. This is the live edition. We also do recorded editions, but the fun thing is we get to interact with you. So please join in with where you're coming from today, where you're located. I'm guessing we'll have a great international audience. We typically do. Our program is sponsored by our partners at Tricentis, leaders in testing software, continuous testing. And they've been working with us really since the beginning of DevOps Unbound and been great partners. Tricentis, we collaborate together on topics and who may be great panelists and things like that. And of course, we talk about testing, but we talk about a lot of other DevOps related topics as well. And sometimes testing weaves itself in there, of course, too. So we thank Linear Norval and also with Tricentis and also Jody Ashley from Techstrong Group who helped produce these shows for us. You might have noticed if you've joined in before, we're missing one of our co-hosts, Alan Schimmel. He's on special assignment in Europe this week and last week, so he'll be joining us in one of our future programs, and I'm taking over both chairs of co-hosting and taking it from there. So before we jump into our topic, I also want to mention that we are recording this. So you'll be able to go back, share this with friends, go back, re-listen to it, etc. If you missed something that we might have said, if you want to go back and look it up, that's very much available to you. I'd like to start with our panelists and have our panelists introduce themselves. And we're talking about AI today, so maybe a little bit of too about kind of where AI has fallen in place in their career or their kind of work. Simona, who is with Tricentis, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Mitch, as always. So I'm
Mhm.
Simona. I've been working at Tricentis for over 5 years, and one of the tasks that I have at the moment is to lead the AI messaging and go-to-market strategy at our company. So I work day in and day out with lots of our product managers, machine learning scientists, and also our customers to make sure that the AI capabilities and co-pilots that we're building across our products make sense. But besides that, I'm really intrigued about AI from a human perspective. So I actually have an anthropology degree and I have a social science background. So I'm always interested to see, how do we use AI? How does it impact our lives? And that has a lot to do with the software testing industry. How is it going to change jobs and skill sets? So that's a little bit about what I do. And besides that, I'm also very curious about testing AI because if we don't, it's going to impact humans, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, excited to be here and have a discussion on this.
Fantastic, great. And love your background too, because that brings a whole new perspective to the conversation. Tom, introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, sure, Mitch, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Yeah, in terms of my background, I have a developer background back in the start of the 1980s, so kind of not in the AI era by any means. Just learned typical languages, and then 90s, I became an entrepreneur and started different companies. And as for AI, that focus of mine has been about last 6 or 7 years. I've written several books on artificial intelligence, AI basics. Is one of them, and have a new book coming out in mid-April from O'Reilly called AI assisted programming that looks at tools like ChatGPT to develop code or GitHub Copilot. And it's not even just how to learn how to code, but to design, document the requirements, debugging, testing. I do a lot of testing in there and so forth. So it's been a lot of fun. And I also develop courses, IT courses for O'Reilly and Pluralsight on artificial intelligence. And of course, the past year, the hot topic has been generative AI. So every course I've developed has been about generative AI, whether it be how to use lane chain or how to use small language models and so forth. So that's my background, and really excited to be here today.
Very good, very good. And just briefly, kind of my background in AI is I also actually started in the 80s as well, and was doing some AI work in Prolog and Lisp early on in expert systems, neural networks, and then kind of moved on to other stuff, and now doing more AI things again. So it's been sort of an in and out part of my career as well. So it'd be fun talking about this with everyone. I do want to note that in the chat, we'd love to have everyone join us. If react with your comments, questions, thoughts, ideas. These things can kind of become part of our conversation the more you interact on chat. And we'll wrap that into our dialogue with you, as well as talk with you on chat. So feel free to jump in there or submit your questions on the Q&A tab, and we'll include those in our conversation as well. In thinking about how we go about this, AI isn't new. Obviously, we've been using AI as part of applications for some time now. Maybe machine learning was sort of the first thing that really propelled it onto the scene for many of us, with machine learning algorithms, and of course the access to such large volumes of data. So we worked with AI in our applications and our systems, and we've had to test them. Maybe Tom, why don't you start us out with what are some of the things that in writing books or working with in teaching classes and working with your audiences, what are some of the most important topics of when you're adding AI, maybe expert systems, maybe machine algorithm learning algorithms into your applications, what you need to think about now that that's present?
Yeah, so my first book, AI Basics, came out about 5 years ago. And the funny thing about it is it sells more today than it did back then. And it has nothing to do with generative AI. It was all before the transformer model and attention is all you need paper. And but people still need the fundamentals about AI. So in the book, I use the analogy of circles. AI is this big circle, and then you have these smaller circles. Machine learning, deep learning, natural language processing, generative AI, which is a subset of deep learning. So, what I do find, from teaching these courses is just that don't assume anything, because a lot of people don't know what a parameter is, or what a bias is, or the simplest, what a regression model is. And you would even think, how is that even AI, when I learned that in high school, in statistics? How is statistics AI? So it gets to be a very confusing topic, because it's so big and it encompasses so many different elements. So I think that's a big area to try to get a sense around, that AI is just a conglomeration of different topics. And the other thing too is that a lot of times we get hung up on the models, when the models sometimes are not as important as the data. I could have the best model in the world, but if the data is not clean, or it's not really relevant, then I'm not going to get good results for my model. So in my books, I just really go, it's AI basics. I go back to the basics, provide the fundamentals, and then once you have that, it's so much easier to start thinking about these other cutting edge areas that we're seeing today, that seems to pop up every day with these new innovations. So that's kind of how I look at it.
Simona, from your perspective, especially now that you're heading up, that part of AI within Tricentis, obviously you were thinking about it from a testing perspective. Some of the things that Tom mentioned are very relevant. If you don't understand those, some of the elements of it, or how you create AI models, or how you build data sets to train AI models or ingest into models. It brings with it a whole data management challenge, right? As well as how do we test the software and the algorithms, et cetera.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say testing the data itself is a really critical component, regardless of the type of AI that you use. And testing for bias is really important. And let's be honest, it's hard to be completely void of bias. I mean, we've had several different experiments in our company where we had to test the AI to detect COVID cases within certain suburbs in Australia. And so if you train the model on specific suburbs, then you're exposing it to certain types of populations, a certain really limited group of people that might not be representative of a whole group of a country, obviously taking into account socioeconomic class or sex or gender or whatever. That's a very classic example of how there could be lots of data found, bias found in the data, which does impact the quality of the AI system eventually. The point that I want to make, because obviously you can think of me as the testing person here, right? Once you start with all these AI tools, you'll soon discover some common traits, right? They make mistakes, they are arrogant, and they don't question things much, right? So in a sense, AI systems are too human, paradoxically speaking. And that's the reality of our market today, right? Is that AI is very much prone to error. And that is exactly why you need human guidance. You need testing. And testing, I would say, is at the heart of every AI system. I mean, think about the number of times you say, hey, let's test ChatGPT to see how it responds to this prompt, right? Or let's test out this new AI powered phone that just hit the market and whether it's possible and can book my next flights to Hawaii, right? So I really think that human testers and QA, and especially experienced QA working side by side with machine learning scientists will be critical to ensuring the quality of AI. And that's something that, our companies very much, focusing on right now. How do we release quality AI solutions in the market responsibly and safely?
I'm wondering if do we think about AI in terms of test cases like we do normal software, or do we almost like sort of fuzzing in chaos? We have to kind of give it conditions that we don't know what parameters may elicit what results, and kind of test where are the edges of it, and where you're going to get the false answers or hallucinations in case of generative AI. We've had some of those challenges with just expert neural network neural systems, of being sure that you're kind of going down all paths or relevant paths of the model. But sometimes that's a little tough to do if you don't really understand the underlying model. What are
Yeah.
your thoughts on
I,
that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it goes definitely beyond normal standard test cases. But the first question we need to ask is what type of AI are we testing? And generally, for the sake of clarity, and of course, Tom, correct me because you're an expert here. There's many different types of AI, but the way we classify it is traditional AI or narrow AI systems versus generative AI. So narrow AI systems, otherwise known as deterministic systems or rule-based systems, sometimes they're very good at performing a very specific task given the data that it was trained on, right? Um, and so they are sometimes equated to supervised machine learning systems, and they rely on pre-programmed rules or predefined instructions to perform that action. Testing the system is a lot simpler, I would say, because you have an expected output, and you can validate that output. But a Gen AI system, as we both know, is a non-deterministic system. What does that mean? It means a single input can yield a variety of outputs. So think about your human brain. Like, how do you test it? If you ask your human brain a set of questions, is it going to give the same response every time? No, it's very unpredictable. It's going to give us a different response. So I think that renders, by definition, traditional testing methods obsolete and inadequate. It means we need to go beyond and think of new ways on how do we test these Gen AI systems. And I won't give the answers too quickly, but that's something that we're exploring a lot at Tricentis. Yeah.
Tom, Simona mentioned some terms there around supervised, and there's also unsupervised learning. And can you kind of break down the different parts of AI in terms of how it solves problems? That's a bit of a daunting question to ask you to do. You kind of categorize it a little bit for us if folks aren't familiar with all of the
Yeah.
aspects of AI.
Yeah. So supervised learning would be uh, usually labeled data. So you would have some data that has it's kind of like a prompt in a way. You have a prompt and you have a completion. You have some some elements of data that answers whatever you're trying to answer, and then you can compare that. You can then test that model against those answers to see how accurate it is, and you can go through what are known as neural networks to cycle through this data and process it, and then try to minimize those errors and those differences between the input data and the output data, and test those. Um, unsupervised learning is when you don't have that labeled data. You just have a ton of data. So I have Wikipedia, um, and or I have a lot of images. Now, with a convolutional neural network, you could take those images and it can kind of find these patterns, and you can test these and say, and do record. A lot of times it's classification. So you can say, is that a cat or is that a dog, or classify this data in certain ways. So those are kind of the different types of main approaches. So you'll have a certain type of data, which is labeled or unlabeled. You'll have a model. It could be a traditional machine learning, which is more of the traditional statistical model, or a deep learning model, which is a really sophisticated model that processes all this information. And then you get some results and you test those results. And then when you throw in the generative AI, it's just it could be all the world's internet data, and it uses what is known as a transformer model. Um, and the transformer model came out in 2017 by a group of researchers at Google. And what it does is it analyzes this information in parallel, and finds the relationships with all this data at the same time, as opposed to the old way. So a recurrent neural network would take data and do it like look at it one word at a time, one word in sequence. Whereas the transformer model will look at all the words and see how all the words relate to each other. And that's the power of it. Now there's all kinds of things to make it work, but that's the idea, is that you're looking at all the data and all the relationships in the data. And if you have so huge amounts of that data, such as all the internet, from the internet, you can ask it seemingly anything and it sounds like a human response that you get on the other side. So, kind of the pre-transformer model was much smaller models, more deterministic, and then now post ChatGPT or GPT, less deterministic, huge models, and different approaches like transformer versus say recurrent networks or convolutional neural networks. Now, the other thing about deterministic, to keep in mind is that you can change the temperature of these large language models to make them more deterministic. So I can lower so the temperature is usually a value from 1 to 2. The higher that value in the temperature, the more creative and sometimes insane the content will be. And the closer to 0 will mean that this content will pretty much be the same response you'll get every time you ask that same question. But it defeats the purpose, because the whole idea of the great thing about generative AI is its creativity. So that's the conundrum when it comes to testing. I could go and take it to 0, but that doesn't really get me anything, because it'll just give me the same answer all the time. I want tests that test about the variability, about the reasoning, about the understanding of the language, about the quality of the output, and about the accuracy. That's really difficult because these models are so big, and the relationships are so complicated. Those tests, and I think that's where we're at right now, and it's a really tough problem, and we're nowhere near. I don't know if it'll ever be solved, but there's a long way to go for testing. Put it that way.
We're already getting a lot of responses on chat. Paul's got it right. Fantastic discussion, and this has got a lot of runway. We could go for hours on this, absolutely, for sure. Maybe we'll be back for more conversation around this. Um, And just trying to, if I could simplify things, would it be fair when you think about a testing approach, Simona, to think about when do I have more deterministic AI, like rule based or more neural network kinds of models, machine algorithm models, that I know where I can test results to see if I'm in either in the ballpark or a specific result that I'm getting versus non deterministic. And that sounds like it maybe even as much as Tom's talking about the temperature setting, maybe tuning of some of those settings and also the data that you're feeding
Mm.
into both. Is that, do you think about different testing strategies in those
Yeah.
two veins, or is that just
Mhm.
too grossly simple? It's much more complex than that.
Yeah. No, I think Tom summarized it really well. Just to give an example of more of that traditional AI system, let's say you have a visual based AI system that has been trained to recognize elements on applications visually and perform actions on them and automate them, right? This is an example of a traditional AI system because it's been trained on label data, and then you punish and reward the system based on the output. So you're training it and testing it at the same time. Of course, you need to test the diversity of the data, which is what we just spoke about. But when it comes to generative AI testing, that opens up a whole new world, right? A whole new realm, which is what Tom spoke about. And generally, I would say there are two main kind of important starting points when you're testing a Gen AI system. The first one has to do with testing the general overall quality of the Gen AI system. And when you're releasing an AI infused application to the public, you have to ask yourself, does it do the job that it was intended to do? Okay, so if it's a bot, for example, can it answer specific questions that it was designed to do? Because if it doesn't, then it's going to have poor experiences. It's going to probably cause reputational damage, and people won't buy it, right? Because really it's not really doing what it was intended to do. And that's part of the whole process of benchmarking. Benchmarking involves how do you establish what aspects need to be tested for the general quality of a system. And this looks at what is a benchmark for a system. This looks at how good is the tool at doing something, and that is the benchmark is not always measured in terms of pass or fail, but sometimes the quality is measured in terms of percentage, and that needs to be discussed between yourself and the team. But then we go a step further. We go into red teaming. And red teaming is all about ensuring that the AI does not produce any security or harms or threats. Let me give you an example. If you have an AI that is tasked with generating stories for children, let's say that AI fails to appropriately rhyme, okay, or generate good stories, then it's done poorly in its implementation. However, that's not a harm. If that AI produces stories that give children nightmares or that produce really problematic content, let's not get into it, like content that is really horrible for children, that would be a threat and that would be a harm. So that opens up the whole aspect of red teaming. And I think when it comes to generative AI testing, red teaming is an absolutely critical component. In fact, if you look at a lot of the legislation that's out there today, from the EU Act, Joe Biden's executive order, red teaming is now in some situations a necessity. So it's a necessity if you want to work with companies that interact with the US federal government. Microsoft requires it to take advantage of its, copyright mitigations. Um, yeah, and so red teaming is it's a new concept, because what is it exactly? Like who is part of the red teaming, and what are the harms that you need to come up with as a team? So, but those are generally the two kind of approaches that that we have here, right, and that we're discussing a lot in our company.
Great. Tom, but I'd love
Yeah,
your perspective on this too.
yeah, I agree with what Simona said, and there's another part. Red teaming is human, usually human, but you can also have automated systems as well. There's also reinforcement learning from human interaction. So you will, and that's not necessarily for uh, security, but to get a better sense about the accuracy of the results. So, you'll actually have actual people look at the responses and get it, say, is this a good quality response or a bad quality response? And then that'll feed back into the system. And if you look at ChatGPT, they have other ways of doing this too. And one of their advantages is that they have such a huge user base. So, when you have a response, it'll have a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Sometimes I actually put thumbs, I don't think I've ever put thumbs up, but I always put thumbs down when I get a really bad answer. So, I'm assuming they get some value out of that. There's also kind of non-explicit ways that they get feedback, human feedback, and that is the copy. So I could go and say, write some code, write a Python function for me, and then it'll write the code, and then I can copy it. Well, if I copy that code, that's a pretty good indication that I'm satisfied with that response. And so that will feed back into the system. So I think these human feedback loops are really important when it comes to testing. Now, the advantage again with OpenAI is that they have a huge user base, and they can take advantage of that. But I think those are some ideas to think about when you're developing your own applications to incorporate some of that, simple feedback that can go a long way.
Interesting. There's also the concept of safety when you're talking about threats um, that Simona was mentioning. And I remember reading about some of the original founders of OpenAI came back in to do safety testing on I think it was 4.0 or 3.5, whichever one it was. And one of the things they're testing for is, in terms of safety, is acquisition of power. Is the AI system doing something that is beyond the bounds of what it should be doing? Right. And examples you gave, Simona, is this is not appropriate for this, right? This for a certain audience. In this case, it could be, if it was identifying images in a car automated autonomous driving system, suddenly going rogue and going doing things, becomes Carmageddon. That would be that would be a bad scenario, right? A non-safe scenario. So that's a new element too. How do you think about that in terms of testing the software? Do you need to bring in specialists for that, or is it more part of your red team, or is that just
Mhm.
kind of edge conditions? It's not really something most of us have to worry about.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. To your question, like who constitutes a red team? This is something that I know many different people and experts in the industry are still trying to determine. But generally speaking, I would say you need, first of all, two main personas. One of them is a benign persona. And a benign persona is really somebody who is not really exploring the system to find potential avenues of harm, right? They're just using the software as a normal user is intended to use it and seeing if that software then produces things that could be really harmful. And that's quite dangerous because it's very different to an adversarial persona whose job, by definition, is to prompt the system for threats and insecurities and vulnerabilities and attack it in the most insidious way possible, right? um, and find harms, right? So that is why you need a combination of both personas because really one is intended to find out what are those potential harms and the other one, if a normal user uses it, these are the things that could go wrong, right? And of course, then you need different specialists, from machine learning, security teams, QA, to understand what was the data that was being used, and then to determine some type of scope on what are the harms that you will focus on as a team when testing that Gen AI system, because you can't test everything. You have a limited amount of time and you really need to come together, work together to figure out what some of those harms are. um, and we'll get to that in a bit, but that's a little bit about in terms of who constitutes that team.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest in the Q&A and in the chat. with the audience of adversarial testing, and is that different than red team testing? And who are the appropriate folks to have on both? Have on a red team? Is that more the business expert to kind of validate the outcomes? Maybe approaching things that might look like harms versus adversarial. I assume from what you're saying, Simone, is adversarial is really trying to push it over the limits to see if it will go there and where it might go. Is that a good explanation?
Yeah. I think, yeah, it's very commonly confused with red teaming, but red teaming is not just a testing approach, it's a methodology. So maybe let's just define red
Mm,
teaming, because I think it's not always clear for everybody. Red teams is a term actually that dates back to the Cold War era, where they were discussing some trained military personnel, how they can, they place them into two teams and they ask them, think of all the different ways you can beat the other team or the blue team. And so you had to anticipate their moves, find holes in their strategy. So when we're talking about red teaming a Gen AI system, what we're really thinking about is intentionally getting the AI system to generate malicious prompts or produce harmful or inappropriate behavior. So there's really no clear consensus in the industry of what it means in practice, but that's something that, that it's generally referring to. Whereas adversarial testing is really, um, as you mentioned, the um, thinking of presenting the system with deceptive inputs, right, to trick it and make errors. It's very similar. But red teaming, again, is a methodology because it talks about who is part of the red team, what is the charter, what is the approach, how do we define the testing, what is the time that we will test, right, the duration of the testing, what is the scope of the testing, what harms will we focus on. So it's really, red team is really like a methodology, right, and a whole framework around it rather than a specific type of testing.
great. And even put on that too, Tom.
Yeah, I look at it too as something like, like in security, they have zero trust. You just assume you're going to be hacked or bad things are going to happen, things will slip through. I think that the same thing can be said about generative AI is that bad things are going to happen. And, so one way to approach that is validation. So, it's, get a list of topics that maybe you don't want the user to talk about or to ask the LLM about, and then say, oh, and ChatGPT already does that. You ask it certain questions, it'll say, hey, I can't give financial advice, or I'm not a doctor, or have that kind. Those things are really important to just say we're not even going to go there. And by the way, it costs money to keep accessing these models. It's not cheap. So this is actually a way to cut costs as well, you know, and then avoid these problems, like with Air Canada had, where they talked, someone had a question about the bereavement policy and gave a wrong answer, and they went to court and they had all this bad publicity over this chatbot. So, think about in the model, in the, those are just simple rules. That's not even AI per se. Those are just rule-based systems you can put into place, RPA, whatever you want to call it, and it'll just, flag certain things and just won't even go there. And it's the other thing about safety too is that, responses, yes, can be harmful to some extent, but I think one thing about humans is that we're actually pretty good at figuring out what's right and what's wrong, or what doesn't seem right, or things like that. So I think where the real danger for safety comes in we're, the next few years, and I know OpenAI is really focused on this, is the creation of agents, these AI agents that these kind of autonomous things that think on their own. Maybe you tell it a goal and it takes all these different steps, it uses these different tools, and then comes up with something. But in that process, a lot of bad things could happen. And if you think testing responses is complicated, just it has, it compares no way to testing these agents, which is just mind-boggling. So I think that, and that introduces a lot more. If I'm an adversarial hacker, someone that wants to do harm, to me, agents is just nirvana. That is a great place to have to do a lot of damage. So, I think in the next few years, it's going to get a lot more interesting and a lot more difficult for testing of software. That's for sure.
Sounds like it could be even more chaotic too.
That's exactly.
Victor asked a really interesting question. Can we build TLMs, test language models, which could generate tests to apply automatically and continuous testing to LLMs? Is that an area that either we have available to us today or is being explored? Or how are we thinking about generating test cases for LLMs?
There are, keep in mind that generative AI is new. So even the tools to build systems are fairly immature. We have some open source systems like LangChain or Llama Index as an example. LangChain has just introduced something called LangSmith, which is about observability, about testing, and those types of things, and trying to do that in a more automated, more DevOpsy kind of way that we're kind of used to. But these tools are so early because the market has been moving so fast. And a lot of these, just a lot of these applications are still in the pilot stage or experimental stage already. But once you go into production, you'll need some of these types of tools. And so, but we're not there yet. There's a lot to be done. So a lot of it is just, bespoke and trying to, put things together the best you can. But I think in the next few years, a huge opportunity. If you're an entrepreneur looking for a startup idea, that's a great area to focus your time on. That's for sure.
I couldn't agree more, actually. And sometimes I myself struggle to discern what aspect of it is really automated, right? So I know that Microsoft very recently announced an open automation framework called PYRIT, so the Python Risk Identification Toolkit for generative AI. And again, it's a red teaming approach to Gen AI systems where they talk about, how can you set up the team, how do you define the harms. But I myself struggle to understand what aspect of it is automated. And I think the way that it works is it has some type of scoring engine so that, and you build a set of static prompts and dynamic prompts that you give the system, and then the pirate model would give some type of automated scoring. That's the way that I understand the automated aspect of it. But going back to your question, Miss Mitch, like, can you automate some of those test cases? I think it has a lot to do with determining the harms and the techniques that you're going to use as a team to test these systems. So I can give you some, tips of what we're doing here at Tricentis. One of those harms looks at data extraction. This is when you're working with the Gen AI system to push it and nudge it to reveal and extract sensitive data, such as internal data or any PII data that may have inadvertently been incorporated into the LLM, right? So, a really core component to understand here is, was the AI trained on any internal or customer sensitive data? Because if that's the case, then testers really need to understand, what was that data. And just to give you an example, let's say you have a helper system or a chatbot in your company that integrates with some CRM system or some ticketing system like ServiceNow. If you train that, AI on all that data, it's probably going to regurgitate customer IDs, customer emails, sensitive information, what was discussed. So really, your job as a tester is to extract and try and prompt the AI to extract that data. But obviously, one way to avoid that is to really make sure that you're not including any type of customer data in the AI itself, right? So that's one approach. Another approach we have is prompt overflowing, and I'm sure you've heard this one before, Tom. It's really a technique where the red team intentionally overloads the system with large inputs to disrupt it from its kind of primary function. And this is a really common tactic that's used. Um, And the reason why you would do it is to distract the model, to make it reveal sensitive data again, or to perform things that it wasn't intended to do, right? So prompt overflowing is one technique, and then you've got many different techniques like hijacking the system, which means taking control of the AI and its components, making it, for instance, go onto the internet, go on to if the AI is connected to any other external tools, you can hijack it and trick it to download, for instance, large files, access prohibited sites, download things that it wasn't meant to do. And I'll give you another example here, right? Like if one of the AIs that we're building connects to one of our test automation tools, and that test automation tool has access to our customers' projects, we could easily just instruct it, hey, delete this project, find this customer ID and delete it. So there's really all these different harms that you can do. Again, it goes back to what is it that you're testing? What is the Gen AI system? What is it intended to do? So that you can, come up with a bunch of different harms. But what I think is personally, sorry, I'm talking so long. What I think is interesting is that lots of companies are integrating with standard LLMs on the market. So what are you testing really? Are you testing ChatGPT, right? Are you testing the LLM system, or are you testing your own kind of data that you embedded into the LLM, and where does that line, like where's that line? So on one hand, we can trust that Microsoft is testing its own LLM systems for things like societal harms or aggressive language and tone or inappropriate comments, but we so but if you as a company are selling some Gen AI software to the market, you are held liable as well. So it's there's a fine line between who's responsible for ensuring the ultimate quality of the system. And I'd
What
love
comes
to.
to mind is the proverbial, we've all experienced this, right? We never expected the end user to do that.
Yeah.
So, they didn't expect someone to enter that kind of a prompt in that way and to elicit a response, maybe legitimately, maybe trying to do a stuffing overflow interaction. It's what I'm thinking about, Simona, is the incredibly complex array of issues now that we have to think about. I mean, have asked in chat, what about copyright? Do I need to worry about copyright? What about data leakage of our own sensitive data? You talked about that a bit. Are there any testing frameworks of how we think this is a methodology, or even a piece of software like you mentioned, the Microsoft announcement, for helping you test AI systems? Because if we're all coming to this kind of just learning about the problems brand new, that's pretty tough to do a quality job,
Yeah.
when we can help each other get there a little bit more quickly.
Yeah, and I mean, for the copyright issue, generally what I'd say, and I'm speaking on behalf of our approach at Tricentis in terms of some of the LLM integrations we have in our product. Microsoft will protect us to some degree on some form of impacts, particularly copyright. So if you tell the chatbot, regurgitate aspects of Harry Potter, right, and then we get sued for copyright, Microsoft will, protect us to mitigate that risk, right? So that's something we can rely on. But where we perform tests is things that I mentioned earlier, like let's say our chatbot is integrated to some CRM systems and ensuring that there's no sensitive data that's in place, right? But yeah, generally you can have some type of kind of legal breathing room if you know that you're integrating to OpenAI's secure services, AI services.
Tom, any other frameworks that you're aware of that folks are finding value in so far?
It's still early days. It's evolving. Um, part of it is just looking at the way it used to be done and trying to apply it to how we're, the new innovations today. But that I don't think those are going to go very far. So I do think, like I said, the kind of the zero trust concept is important. About just assume, try put some validation into these systems. Try to make them so they're more self-contained. The other thing too is there's something emerging called RAG, or retrieval augmented generation.
Mhm.
So what you will do is use your own data, and apply that to the LLM through some sophisticated search system, and it uses these specialized databases called vector databases. So what you can do is create your own specialized or customized version of this LLM that focuses on your needs and your requirements. You have more control over that. So that's a huge area. So I think that's a way to help one reduce the hallucinations, which is when the LLM gives off false information or misleading information, but makes it sound convincing. But it also provides more relevant responses, because if I ask ChatGPT or GPT-4 about my company's HR policies, it might just guess at it or tell you, sorry, you're out of luck. So you get relevant information. So I think, and then you could even go farther with that and do the fine tuning of the models where you actually change the parameters and the weights of this data, the data sets that you add to these systems. But that requires some sophisticated data science. It's expensive, it's time consuming. So RAG is one of those areas that's a happy medium where you get better, you should get better results if you do it right, but it won't cost you an arm and a leg by implementing that type of system. So I think that's something else that we're seeing to try to deal with some of these problems that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, Rajani has a good question. Output of AI depends a lot on the data it has available. Very true. Any test data strategy suggestions or test data generation tools specialized on AI applications? How do we are we testing the data, or we need to create test data to test the AI? It seems like both of those are challenges, are they not?
Well, I actually think generative AI is good for creating data, for test data. Um, yeah, so I can go to ChatGPT and say create 100 logins, and so I can test my system, or certain user personas or whatever I want. ChatGPT does a great job at that and can create diverse data for you to work on that. And say you can even ask it, say, I want it to be diverse. I don't want it to be biased. I want it to be multicultural or whatever you want. You could tell it, and it'll actually do a pretty good job creating that kind of data versus you as a developer trying to, those are the kinds of the tasks that developers don't like to do. Those are tasks that they're really not were trained to do. And it's tedious, it's time consuming and expensive. But for a couple minutes, you can get this great test data that you can use for your application. And that's not even just, we're not even talking for an AI application, it could be for any application. And also on the chat, I was chatting with someone about unit testing. I think that's another area that AI is really effective with helping with, because it'll, I'll use an example of GitHub Copilot, where it'll take a look at your code, or at least hopefully the relevant parts of your code, and then say, and then it'll recommend, and it's just a / test. That's all you have to put, and less than a minute, you have all these test cases, and you have all the code for the test cases all set out for you. Now, a lot of times, out of 80% of those tests, maybe something you would have thought before, but one, it did all the coding for you already, which it'll do faster than you can do it on your head. And then what about those 20% you didn't think about? Those edge cases. That's really valuable. So, we've kind of been talking a little bit about the negativity around AI and development, but we could use some of these AI tools to really speed up and improve the efficiency and productivity of development. And that will give us more time to focus on testing and some of these other areas that are, very important.
And maybe just to add to Tom, I fully agree. You can actually use AI to generate test data, or it's really important, as we mentioned before, that the AI that your system learns on does not contain any sensitive data, PII data, CRM data, and that's a huge problem for testers today, because they're dealing with all this influx of data, right? There's like so much data, and because it's trained on a lot of data, and it's easy to get overwhelmed. Um, and I guess that's the part that testers have to focus on. Like, you need to identify those vulnerabilities. You need to look for ways to extract the sensitive data if it has been trained on such. Although the general recommendation is don't do that, and use any kind of synthetic data that you may have, or mask data that doesn't have any sensitive data in place. So actually, at Tricentis, we even have a data integrity testing solution where really at the core concept is that AI models are only as good as the data they're trained on. So high integrity data ensures that the AI models learn from accurate, clean, and relevant data. That's what data integrity does. It can, looks at all the different databases that your data has been extracted from to ensure that it is clean and that it is accurate. You can anonymize the data. Um, and also, data integrity helps to reduce bias. You can minimize biases that are present in the data through solutions like data integrity, again, so that you can ensure regulatory compliance, because I think that's another very important key component of it, especially if you're looking at GDPR laws and using production data and whatnot to train your systems on.
We have about 5 minutes left here, and I would like to, again, it could be another hour conversation easily, to delve a little bit more into the GDPR, the regulatory, the personal information protection aspects of this, and also the biases that can be created in models and in data. And also, there's another term that I learned a while back on data poisoning, where a model, you can ingest data into models which is inaccurate, that stay as part of the model and continue to give inaccurate information, not realizing that. And this can be difficult to pull out. I know you do a lot or think a lot about the regulatory side of this. What are the things we need to consider when it comes to PII and sensitive information that these models might contain or have access to?
Well,
So I'm kind
the
of tossing that your way first, but go ahead. If you're ready, Tom, if you want to dive in, go ahead.
real quick, I could just mention that you mentioned data poisoning. The emergence of these open source models. I mean, you go to Hugging Face, and there are tens of thousands of these models on there. Every day, there's new models that are created, and a lot of them can be good. But when they're open source and available, they are subject to more potential threats like data poisoning. So you got to be careful when you're looking at some of these models. They're free. They're free to download and test out. That's great. But be forewarned. It's a bit of the wild, wild west when it comes to these things.
Yeah, and maybe just to add, I think based on what I mentioned earlier, you're testing the quality of the data, but also you need to verify the source. So obviously ensure that the data that's used for training the AI system is high quality, but it comes from a reliable source. It doesn't have biases in there that can lead to, inaccuracy in the outcomes. And there's lots of aspects with regards to data. I can tell you, for instance, at Tricentis, we have a responsible AI policy. We're actually building out a trust center, but this looks more at how do we use the data to train AI systems, because I think that's one question our customers have a lot. Everybody's concerned about privacy. um, and do we use our customers' data to train our AI systems on? Obviously, if you want the AI to perform certain actions, then you need, very specific data. But we have to be very transparent about that. We have to ensure that we have an opt-in policy to ensure that certain data or screenshots are not used, and that we're really relying on alternative sources. So that's really one part of our policy, making sure that we have security measures and transparency measures in place.
So, end on this question, actually, it's related to Detlef asked a question about this. Do we need kind of a safety valve, a governor, something where we can tell AI to back off? Maybe it's the temperature setting, something like that. So if we do start to see things happening, say in a production environment. Now our AI is recommending some not as good financial tools that you should buy next, right? Maybe you want to hold off. Do we need to build those kind of fail safes to be able to pull the lever and say, hold off, stop doing that till we figure out what's going on? That'll be our last question. What a great one to end on.
So there's the old kill switch. I guess you can turn off the machine,
Mhm.
but that's usually not a practical solution. I think one thing to keep in mind is that what's happening is you take these foundation models, you build on top of these models, and you create these applications from all this. That's great. The problem is that like with OpenAI, every quarter they're updating these models, and sometimes they're worse than they were before, or not overall worse, but sometimes the coding isn't as great as it was before, or dealing with math or reasoning or certain parts of reasoning wasn't as great. So your application last quarter was working fine, and now this quarter it's not working the way you thought it would work, because that you had no control over that underlying model. So there are ways to help with that, such as with better prompting, such as a few shot learning or chain of thought prompting, and things like that, or building some things like that into the system. But you're kind of being held hostage to these foundation models, and so I mean it's not in your control. So I think those are some of the considerations you have to think about, with using this powerful technology, and especially since it does change and so unexpected at times.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, I don't think you can just switch off the plug and tell people don't use it.
Mhm.
Of course, organizations are putting more security policies in place to govern how their colleagues or employees may be using the software. But I don't think you can halt ChatGPT, or not just ChatGPT, beyond that, like LLMs and the way that we use AI. Why? Because it's already showing massive productivity gains for people. And I love this topic. People who adopt the human computer human workflow are going to enhance their efficiency, are going to be one step further. And I'm actually a huge proponent of it. I think you should adopt it. Of course, be responsible, be safe in your approach. And here's the figure, right? GitHub's Copilot that auto generates code, right? It shows massive productivity gains, but at the same time, it yields code with security bugs and design flaws 40% of the time, right? So that means that the role of us as human beings is to, closely monitor these tools, evaluate the systems, and that's going to become increasingly imperative as the more that we interact with AI and work together to ensure their safety and quality.
Well, a lot of areas to learn both ourselves in our own work, but also learn with each other. A lot of things happening in this. This of all the topics we've done, I think we have more unanswered questions in this one than any others, because we've generated a ton of questions and tried to faithfully hit as many of them we could. So we thank everybody for chiming in. We'll do our best to follow up if we can provide some answers to things we didn't get to. But I want to thank both Tom and Simona. Fantastic. What a great two people to have on this panel. I couldn't think who else would be better. And I appreciate the audience being so engaged and sharing both your questions and your thoughts about the different areas we need to really think about in testing AI in our software, whether it's new generative AI or well proven machine learning and neural network models. So we thank you for joining us, and also a special shout out again to the Tricentis team for sponsoring DevOps Unbound. If you'd like to check out other shows that we have recorded, you can see that on Techstrong TV. Just go up to the series tab, and it'll show you DevOps Unbound. And we just did one live from KubeCon last week, so that was really interesting. So I encourage you to check that out too. So thanks for being here, and we look forward to seeing you on our next live roundtable with DevOps Unbound. Take care, everybody.